ジからの場所は時間はどのくらいかかるの
15-16時間かかるしてたお母さんが。
わあすごいね、
カリフォルニアまでドライブまたリターンするんだから。
なんていうとこ
ブライス、
プライス
アリゾナと国境だ。
prepared people to accomplish his purposes for him in history. He was preparing Washington, using him. Now uses everyone, uses all of us, prepares all of us, but some people, he so chooses to have more of a significant influence in the advance of liberty and Christian truth in history, and Washington was one of those men. So through his life and his early training by his parents and others who had input into his life, the character, knowledge, and skills were being developed to enable him to accomplish his mission. This was attested to the great Christian character of Washington by one who knew him very intimately, his personal secretary, Tobias Lear, who, after Washington served his second term as president, retired to Mount Vernon, and Tobias Lear moved into his home to help him with a lot of his correspondence. And after living in his home, serving him very intimately for a couple of years, Tobias Lear wrote, "I have never found a single thing that could lessen my respect for him. A complete knowledge of his honesty, uprightness, and candor in all his private transactions has sometimes led me to think him more than a man." Now this is the testimony of someone who knew him intimately. What a testimony of Christian character. Just think if someone lived in your house and observed you for a couple of years, could they say the same thing about you? But they did of Washington. Sometimes think him to be more than a man. Of course, he was just a man, but he was a man God raised up with Christian character for a very important function. John Adams, after Washington led us in the victory in the American Revolution, Washington became probably the most famous man in the world. Everybody was honoring him for defeating the greatest military power in the world. John Adams wrote he was fearful that the people were making a god out of him. They extolled him so much. I love the anecdotal story of while Washington was president, most of that time he served his presidency in Philadelphia, that's before D.C. was built, that he one day was walking down the street, and right across the street a man and his young son were walking along. Now of course at this time most people had no pictures, you didn't have photographs, didn't have paintings, which were very wealthy, so didn't really know who anybody looked like. You might hear about them and read about them in the papers, but you didn't know who they were. So as they're walking along, the father looked across the street, and there was General Washington, the president at the time, and he made the remark to his young son, "Why, look, there goes General Washington." And the little boy looked up, and he said, "Why, he's a man after all." He'd heard so much about him, thinking he must be a god. But the people did know him and honor him, and Tobias Lear exemplified in those words one reason why: because of his great Christian character. There's power in Christian character. That's what made Washington a powerful man. The story goes, when Washington was first selected as the commanding general of the Continental Army in July of 1775, he assumed command of the army up around the Boston area because fighting had begun a few months before that. In his very first orders that he issued to the troops, in those orders he forbade, quote, profane cursing, swearing, and drunkenness. Now we might think, well, man, if we could just get our troops to swear, not do all the other stuff, we'd be in good shape. But our founders thought one of the lowest, the basest sins you could commit was swearing, because it shows no self-government. They also understood that what someone evokes in word, it will follow in deed. And if you appeal to the low and debased things, which profanity does, it reflects what's in your heart and your mind. So they wanted to put a stop to that, and that's why he would issue orders forbidding that taking place. So everybody knew it. The troops knew it. Officers knew it. This was an order from General Washington. Well, during the war, at some point, Washington one day was entertaining some officers in his tent for an afternoon meal. And during the After he uttered the oath, Washington dropped his knife and fork, and in his characteristic dignity said, "I thought that we all supposed ourselves gentlemen." And he resumed eating. Well, the remark struck like an electric shock, and as was intended, did execution. No person swore at the table after that. And when dinner was over, the officer referred to said to a companion that if the general had given him a blow over the head with his sword, he could have borne it, but that the home thrust which he received was too much. You know, Washington was not a talkative person. He was not known as a great speaker, but when he spoke, there was power in his words. That's because the character behind the words gave them power. And people listened, as this example indicates. Certainly Washington's great Christian character was on display throughout the American Revolution. In fact, that's what sustained him and enabled him to endure hardship that we can hardly imagine. You know, one of the most difficult times during the American Revolution, it wasn't in a battle, it wasn't fighting, but it was in that winter of 1777 and 1778 when the troops went into winter quarter at Valley Forge. Now, during the winter, it was typical that armies would not fight. It was just too messy in the field. You couldn't get your troops out to fight. And that winter, 77, 78, the British took refuge in Philadelphia, in the city. They could go into people's homes, quarter their troops there. And Washington wanted to be close in case something happened, so he marched his troops into a little area outside the city called Valley Forge, next to the Schuylkill River. And when the troops marched into Valley Forge, they were in desperate situation. They didn't have enough clothes, they didn't have enough food. In fact, Washington wrote there in the end of 1777, he said, "For the want of shoes, their marches through frost and snow might be traced by the blood from their feet. And they were almost as often without provisions as with them." See, their boots had worn out, so they'd take rags, wrap the rags around their feet, but as they marched along on the ice and the snow, it would cut through the rags, cut into their feet, and they would bleed. And he said you could see their marches from all the blood from their feet. They are marching into the winter Valley Forge in this desperate situation. It only got worse throughout the winter. Baron von Steuben, who was a Prussian soldier, testified of the difficult situation. He said the men were literally naked, some of them in the fullest extent of the word. Lafayette said the army frequently remained whole days without provisions. In fact, many men's feet and legs froze till they became black, and it was often necessary to amputate them. You know, of his some, I don't think, 10 to 12,000 troops that were there at Valley Forge, only a quarter of them were fit to go into the field. The others were sick. Their legs were frostbitten. They had to cut them off. It was an extremely desperate situation. George Washington wrote to the Congress, he said, "I feel superabundantly for them, and from my soul I pity those miseries which it is neither in my power to relieve or prevent." It pierced his heart, the hardships that he saw his troops undergoing here in what's been called the crucible of freedom. One historian, Henry Brown, describes well the importance of Valley Forge. He said, "The blood that stained this ground did not rush forth in the joyous frenzy of the fight. It fell drop by drop from the heart of a suffering people. They who once encamped here in the snow fought not for conquest, not for powers, not for glory, not for their country only, not for themselves alone. They served here for posterity. They suffered here for the human race. They bore here the cross of all the people. They died here that freedom might be the heritage of all." We have great liberties in the United States of America. but it was purchased by a great price. We don't know the price. We don't teach these things to Americans today, and hence we're taking for granted the great liberty that we possess, which is not the condition of almost all men throughout all of history. And we will lose that liberty, and are losing that liberty, if we don't communicate the high price that was paid to purchase it. Scenes like this at Valley Forge, the suffering these men went through, and you might wonder, how could they endure such hardship? How did they stay together? Why didn't they just flee and say, I'm going home, I've had enough, it doesn't look like we have any chance to win? But it was Washington's character. That alone helped hold this people together during this difficult winter. It was Washington's faith, which was on display during this time as well. During that difficult winter, Washington, as one observer said, morning and evening his tent was a place of prayer. He would cry out to God, lay the cause of his bleeding country at the throne of grace, recognizing without your aid and assistance, Lord, we can never endure. We can never stand up under these hardships. So he would pray. People observed that from Henry Muhlenberg, who had introduced Lutheranism into America, to pastors and others, and even the Tories. Tories were the Americans who sided with the British, and the story goes that one of the Tories, his name was Isaac Potts, he had a farm that was in the area of Valley Forge, and one day he was riding through the woods to his farm, and he heard a noise out in a little grove of trees, and he walked up slowly, looked into the grove, and there he saw General Washington down on his knees in prayer at Valley Forge. Some of you may have well seen that famous picture. One of the books I wrote called America's Providential History, we have a picture that, interestingly, an immigrant from Norway, Arnold Freeberg, wrote back in the painted back in the 70s as a gift to his country, to show America what the nation is meant to him. But it shows Washington on his knees in prayer at Valley Forge, which depicts well the heart of the commanding general and the heart of the American people. Well, Isaac Potts, after he stood there and listened for some time to Washington pour out his heart to his God, snuck away, went home, back to his home, and he remarked to his wife, he said, if there is anyone on this earth whom the Lord will listen to, it is George Washington. And I feel a presentiment that under such a commander, there can be no doubt of our eventually establishing our independence, and that God in his providence has willed it so. So here Washington, seeking God in prayer, and many others did as well. The nation was praying. They recognized without God's assistance, we're never going to win this battle. In the natural, there's no hope at all. But so they prayed, and guess what? God answered their prayers miraculously in many ways. Now, as I said, they were starving to death. They didn't have enough food to eat. But here in the late winter, in the latter part of the winter, 1778, one day some of the troops noticed the Schuylkill River began to be, it looks like it was boiling. And as they came up closer and looked, they saw that it was caused by thousands and thousands of shad migrating up the river, and very early, unusually. And so they said, look at all the fish. And so they grabbed pitchforks and shovels, waded out into the water, and began to fish with pitchforks and shovels. I don't know if you ever fished with pitchforks and shovels before, but they did, throwing up the fish on the land. God miraculously provided a source of food that they desperately needed, an answer to prayer. Another answer to prayer took place when early on at Valley Forge, a professional Prussian soldier, Baron von Steuben, marched into the camp, offered his services to George Washington. And now, you know, the Continental Army that Washington commanded were a bunch of farmers. They weren't trained professional soldiers. They were against, the professional soldiers of England. But they had lost battle after battle. They had some few victories. But they needed some military training, and here it was. God answered their prayer. And so Baron von Steuben took the officers, ran them through drills, who then trained the troops. So they marched in, an undisciplined band of farmers, to Valley Forge, but when they marched out, they had had this training that would sustain them for the years that followed and eventually gain our independence in the war. God answered a prayer that way as well. And another answer to prayer was with early spring. Word came that the nation of France was going to become an ally of the United States and fight upon our half, because Britain was their mortal enemy, and they thought after the Battle of Saratoga, oh, maybe these guys can win this thing. And so they said, we're going to come and bring you much needed money and troops, which would assure our victory. And in response to getting this good news, George Washington issued orders that said, it having pleased the almighty ruler of the universe propitiously to defend the cause of the United American States, and finally by raising up a powerful friend among the princes of the earth, to establish our liberty and independence upon a lasting foundation, becomes us to set apart a day for gratefully acknowledging the divine goodness and celebrating the event which we owe to his benign interposition. So here it is. Washington said he recognized God raises up nations and he puts down nations. He's done it from all of history. You read the Bible, he does it all the time, but he continued to do it here. He said God has raised up France to support the cause of America, American liberty. The sacred cause of liberty is the cause of God, as many preachers preached during that time. And he recognized God raised him up, come to our aid, so we're giving thanks to God. We're going to go to church, give him thanks for this. And so Washington's Christian character, his faith, was really what held the army together, that enabled them to survive this crucible of freedom, this difficult situation. But you know, throughout the American Revolution, the providence of God was evident upon his life. Remember, 1755, Battle of Monongahela. Now, all the troops, everybody knew that story. They knew he was a man of providence. They knew God had protected him. And over again, during the American Revolution, when he was exposed to gunfire, bullets were flying by and cannonballs blowing up, when his aides covered their head, at times when Washington exposed himself, thought, this is it, this time, he's done for. But time after time, he was miraculously preserved. A man of providence. Everybody knew this. He wrote about it, they wrote about it, and there's many, many stories that we could examine that reflect God's providence at work through the war. I'll just mention a couple of those. One of those took place in the summer of 1776 at the Battle of Long Island. In August of that year, the British, some 32,000 British troops, encountered maybe 9,000 American forces on Long Island. The first day of battle, about 1,000 of Washington's troops were killed. He was outnumbered 4-1, and at the end of the day, he found himself backed up against the East River, surrounded by the British Army. Well, the next morning, a storm had come up, and the situation, they were surrounded on all sides on land. Behind them was the mile-wide East River, and thankfully, because of the storm, contrary winds kept the British fleet down at Staten Island, so they couldn't sail up the river and completely surround them. But for some strange reason, Lord Howe, that next day didn't press his advantage. He didn't attack. In fact, he didn't for a couple of days. Nobody knows why. He could, if he had done that, he would have easily defeated the Americans. That would have been the end of the war, but he didn't. So Washington found himself in a very difficult position. Now, he wasn't going to fight, outnumbered 4-1, probably been suicide. He certainly wasn't going to surrender, so he decided, I'm going to try a miraculous night escape across the river. Under the cover of darkness, the British won't know what's going on. So he secretly sent out word to all the surrounding area, anybody who has any kind of boat, a rowboat, a scoop, anything that moves in the water, bring it here tonight. And so they did. They assembled all these boats, and they began to load the troops under the cover of darkness to evacuate across the river. Now, one problem was all the storms that had been taking place churned up the water, and they could barely load the boats. They couldn't even load them half full because the water would crash over the sides in fear of capsizing the boats. And so he thought, well, we're never going to make it at this rate. But Providentially, about 11 o'clock that night, the storm stopped, everything became calm, the sea water was calm, they were able to load the boats and to continue the evacuation. Now, during the night, there was a Tory family that lived in the area, and they began to recognize, this the movement of troops and getting in the boat.